In this video, I will show you how to create, read, update and delete clients using Blazor Web Assembly, Entity Framework and SQL Server database. So here we have the list of clients, and to create a new client we can use this button. Then we need to fill this form. And to update the client details we can click on this button. Then we can update the client details. And to delete a client we can click on this delete button. So here if we click on cancel, nothing happens. And if we click on delete, the client will be deleted. Then in the next video I will show you how to use one-to-many relationship using Entity Framework and how to download and upload files. So we can click on this button. So here we have the client details and we have the different invoices of this client. So to add another invoice we can click on this input field. Then let's select a file. So we can select this file for example. Then open, and we can see that the file has been uploaded. Now to download this file we can click on this link. And we obtain this file. And to delete a file we can click on this button. So we can see that the file has been deleted. First let's create a new project. So here we can select CSharp and Web, and we can select ASP.NET Core Web API. Then next, let's call this project API, and let's call the solution Web App. Let's click on Next. Then here let's select the version of the .NET framework, so I will use .NET 7. Also I will disable Swagger because I will use Postman, so let's uncheck this box. So I will not use Swagger because it will be removed from .NET 9. So here we can see that on GitHub, on the repository of ASP.NET Core, we can see that Swagger will be removed in .NET 9. Let's click on Create. So by default we have this controller and we have this model. Let's delete them. Then let's install Entity Framework packages. So we can make a right click on this project, then manage NuGet packages. Let's click on browse, and here we can type EF SQL Server. So we need this package that allows us to connect to SQL Server. So let's select it, and because I am using .NET 7, I will choose version 7 of this package. Then install. So now the package is installed correctly. Now we need to install another package. So let's write EF tools. Let's select this package. Let's select the version. Then install. So we need this package because it allows us to execute these commands on the Package Manager console. Now let's close this page. And let's create the DB context class that allows us to connect to the database. So it is a service, so let's create a new folder. And let's call it services. Then let's create a new class. And let's call it application DB context. Let's extend the DB context class of Entity Framework. And let's create the constructor. So we can use this helper. And let's select this option. Now let's add this DB context class to the service container. So let's go to program.cs. And let's add it to the service container. So just here, we can call builder.services.addDBContext. And we will add a DB context class of type application DB context. Let's configure the DB context class. So we will connect to SQL Server, so we need to call use SQL Server. And we need to provide this method with the name of the connection string. So let's provide it with a string. Let's write name is equal to and the name of the connection string. We can call it default connection, for example. Then let's define this connection string in appsettings.json. So this is appsettings.json. We need to create a new section. And let's call it connection strings. Then let's create our default connection string. So I will use this connection string. I will connect to the server that is available on my computer. This is the name of the database. I will use Windows authentication, so we need to add trusted connection is equal to true, and we need to trust the server certificate. Now let's create a module that allows us to create a table in the database. So let's create a new folder. And let's call it modules. Then let's create a new class. And let's call it client. Then let's add the different properties of this module. So we need the ID, which is the primary key. We need the first name, the last name, the email address, the phone number, the address, the status, and the date. Then let's configure the email address to be unique. So here we need to decorate this module with the index attribute. And we need to define the name of the property that should be unique. So here the name of the property is email. And we need to define a property called isUnique. Now let's add a new property in application.db context that allows us to create the clients table in the database. So we can create this property, and the name of this property will be the name of the table in the database. So we will create a table that is described by the client module. Let's add the namespace. Now let's save all the files. And let's create a new migration file. So let's click on Package Manager console. And let's write add migration and the name of the migration file. Let's call it first migration. So this migration file has been created and it allows us to create the clients table in the database. Now let's create the table. So we need to call update database. Now let's connect to the database. So we will connect to this database. So we can use Visual Studio and we can click on Server Explorer. Then let's create a new connection. So I will connect to the server that is available on my computer, and the name of the database is DB100. Then let's trust the server certificate. So let's click on Advanced and let's set Trust Server Certificate to True. Then OK. Now let's expand this connection. Then let's expand tables, and here we have the clients table. So now let's fill this table with some data. So we can make a right click, then new query, and let's write the SQL query that allows us to fill the clients table. So I will use this query that allows us to fill the clients table with these clients. Let's execute this query, so we can click on this button. And here we can see that 16 rows have been inserted. Now let's create a new API controller that allows us to perform CRUD operations on clients. So let's create it in the controllers package. Let's select API, then API controller empty, then add. And let's call it clients controller. So this controller will be accessible at the URL /API/ the name of the controller without the word controller. So it will be accessible at the URL /API/clients. Now let's create the constructor that allows us to request the application.db context from the service container. Then let's save it into a field, so we can use this button. Then create and assign field context. Then let's create a new action that allows us to read the available clients. So we can create this method called getClients that will return a list of client objects. It will be accessible using the get method at the URL /API/clients. So here we will return the list of clients. So we can write context, which is our application DB context, .clients.order by descending to display the newest clients first, and we will order the clients by descending order of ID. Then we will return the list of clients. Let's run the application. So by default, the application will run in the browser. So here we can see that we are using this port number. Let's delete the name of this controller that we already deleted, and let's write API/clients. And here we have the list of clients. So now I will show you how to change the port number and how to disable the browser. So let's go to Properties and let's open this file. Then let's update the profile that we are using to run the application. So let's update this HTTPS profile, and here we don't need the browser. So let's set this property to false. Then let's change the port number of HTTPS. So here we can use the port number 4000, for example. Let's save the file and let's run the application again. Now the application is running and we don't have the browser. So let's test the application using Postman. Let's open a new tab. Let's select the get method and let's provide the URL. So the port number is 4000 and the endpoint is /API/clients. Let's click on Send. And here we have the list of clients. Now I will show you how to read a client by ID. So let's create a new action. So we can create this method getClient that requires the client ID that should be available in the URL. So we will access to this action using the HTTP get method, and then we need to read the client having this ID. So we can call context.clients.find, and this is the client ID. If we don't find a client with this ID, then we will return not found. Otherwise, we will return a success response with the client data. Let's run the application. Then let's add the client ID in the URL. So here we have a success response, and here we have the details of the client having the ID 4. Let's provide an ID that does not exist. 40, for example. So now we have not found. Now I will show you how to create clients. So first let's create a DTO model that allows us to create clients. Let's create it in the models package. And let's call it client DTO. Then let's add the different properties of this class. So we need the first name, which is required, the last name is required, the email address is required and should have the email address format. Then we have the phone number, which is optional, and if we provide the phone number, then it should have the phone number format. The address is optional, and then we have the status that is required. Then let's create a new action in clients controller that allows us to create clients. So we can create this method, create client, that will be accessible using the post method. We need the submitted data that allows us to create a new client, and if the data of this object is not valid, then we will not execute this method. Otherwise, if the submitted data is valid, then we will execute this method. So just here, we need to check if we have another client having the same email address, because in the client model, the email address should be unique. So first let's check if we have another client having the same email address. So if we have another client having the same email address, then we need to add an error to the model state, so it will be related to the email property of the model, and the error message will be the email address is already used. Then let's add this model state to an object of type validation problem details, and let's return a bad request with this object. Otherwise, the email address is not used, so we can create a new client using the submitted data of client DTU. So we can create this client using the data of client DTU, then we need to save this client in the database. So we can call context.clients.add and we will add this client. Then we need to save the modifications and we can return a success response with the created client. So we can return OK of client. Let's run the application. Let's create a new tab. Let's select the post method and let's provide the URL. Then let's submit the data in the request body. So let's select body, let's select row, then JSON. Then let's send this object. So here we can see that we have a success response, and here we have the created client. So here we have the client ID and the date, which is the current date. Now I will show you how to update clients. So let's go to clients controller and let's create a new action. So we can create this method that will be accessible using the HTTP put method. It requires the client ID that should be available in the URL and the submitted data, which is of type client DTU. First, let's check if the submitted email address is already used by another client or not. So if we have another client having the same email address, then we can return an error message related to the email address, which is the email address is already used. So here we can return a bad request with the validation object that we created just here. Otherwise, let's check if we have a client with this ID. So if we don't have a client with this ID, then we can return not found. Otherwise, we need to update the client details with the submitted data. So here we will update the client details using the submitted data of client DTU. Then we need to save the data in the database. So we need to call context.savechanges. Then we can return a success response with the updated client. So we can return OK of client. Let's run the application. Let's create a new tab. Let's select the put method. And let's provide the URL. So let's update the client to the ID 17. Let's select body, then row, then JSON. And let's send this object. So here we can see that we have a success response and we have the updated client profile. Now let's create a new action that allows us to delete clients. So we can create this method that will be accessible using the HTTP delete method, and it requires the client ID that we have to provide in the URL. So we need to read the client having this ID. If we don't have a client with this ID, then we can return not found. Otherwise, we need to delete the client from the database. So we need to call context.clients.remove and we will delete this client. Then we need to save the modifications and we can return a success response. Let's run the application. Let's create a new tab. Let's select the delete method. And let's provide the URL. So let's delete the client to the ID 17. So if we click on send the first time, we have a success response. This means that the client to the ID 17 has been deleted. And if we send the request again, this time we have not found. Now I will show you how to connect to the web API using a front-end application. So I already prepared this HTML file that will connect to the web API using JavaScript. Let's take a look at the source code. So here we have this table and we will fill this table using JavaScript. So we will call this method to fill this table and we will call this statement to read the data from this URL. Now let's open this file using the browser. But for the moment we can see that the table is empty. Let's take a look at the console. And here we can see that we have this error. We have cross-origin request blocked. So to fix this error, we need to enable course. So let's go to our application. Let's go to program.cs. Then let's configure the pipeline to enable course. So we need to call app.useCourse and we need to allow any header, any method, and any origin. Let's run the application again. Let's refresh the page. And this time we have the list of clients. For the moment we created this web API. So now let's create the Blazor application. So let's create a new project. Then let's select CSharp and web. And let's select Blazor Web Assembly standalone application. So let's select this option, then next. Let's call the project a Blazor app, for example, then next. Then create. So now we have two applications, the backend application and the front-end application, and we need to run them together. So let's select this solution, then properties. And to run these two applications together, we need to select this option. And here let's select start and let's select start here as well. Let's click on OK. Then let's run the application. So we obtain this Blazor application that is running at this port number. And of course the web API is also running. So here we can see that we have two consoles. This is for the web API. And this is for the Blazor application. Now let's create a new Razor component that allows us to display the available clients. So let's create it in the Pages folder. And first let's create a new folder. Let's call it Clients. Then let's create a new component. And let's call it Index. Then let's define the route of this component. So at the top we have to add @page. Then the URL. So this component will be accessible at the URL /clients. Let's change the title of this page. So we can write a list of clients and we can display it in the center of the page. Also we can add this Bootstrap button that should allow us to create new clients. So when we click on this button, we will go to the URL /clients/create. So later we need to create a new Razor component that will be accessible at this URL. Then let's add a link to this component in the nav menu. So let's go to the shared folder and let's open this file, navmenu.razor. So for the moment we can see that we have this nav that contains several items. So we have the home item, the counter item, and we have also this item. So let's keep the home item and let's delete this item. Then let's rename this item. So here we can write clients. Then let's update the URL. So it will be the URL of this component, which is /clients. So here we have to write /clients. Let's run the application. So now we can see that we have these two items. Let's click on clients and we obtain this component. Let's click on home and we have the home component. Now let's create a new model that allows us to read the clients from the server. So the model will be the same as the model that we defined in the API. So it will be this client model. So let's copy the different properties of this class, but we don't need the entity framework attribute. Then in the Blazor application, let's create a new folder. And let's call it models. Let's create a new class. And let's call it client. Then let's paste the different properties. Now let's go to the index component. And here we need to read the different clients from the web API. So let's go to the code section. So let's create this field, which is a list of client objects. So it can be null. Then when the component is initialized, we will send a request to the web API at the URL /API/clients to read the available clients. Then we will store the received clients in this field. Then let's check if we have the list of clients or not. So if clients is null, then we can display this text. Otherwise, we can display the list of clients. So let's add else. Then let's create a table to display the available clients. So we can display this Bootstrap table. In the table head, we have these cells. So we will display the client ID, the name, the email address, the phone number, the status, the date, and action. So in the action column, we will display two buttons, the edit button and the delete button. So for the moment, the table body is empty. So for every client that we have in this list, we need to create a table row. So for every client that we have in the clients list, we will create this table row. So in the first cell, we will display the client ID. In the second cell, we will display the first name plus space plus last name. Then we will display the email address, then the phone number, then the status. We will display the date of creating this client account. Then this is the last cell. So in the last cell, we will display two buttons. So this is the first button, it is the edit button, and this is the second button, and it is the delete button. So when we click on edit, we will go to the URL /clients/edit, and we will add the client ID. And when we click on the delete button, we will display the component that is accessible at the URL /clients/delete/the client ID. Let's run the application. But here we can see that we have errors. So let's click on no. And we can see that the client model cannot be found. So to fix the error, we need to add the namespace of the client model. So just here, we can add @using. And the namespace is Blazor app.models. Let's run the application again. So here we have another error. So we need to request the HTTP service from the service container. So here we can see that we are using this service and we need to request it from the service container. So just here we can add @inject. And we need to inject this service, which is of type HTTP client. Let's run the application. Let's click on clients. And here we can see that we have the list of clients. Now I will show you how to create clients. So first let's create a client DTO model in the Blazor application. So here let's create a new class. And let's call it client DTO. Then we can copy the source code from the client DTO that we have in the web API. So here we need only to copy the properties and we don't need to copy the attributes because we will not perform the validation in the Blazor application. So the validation will be done on the server. So let's copy the different properties. And let's paste them here. Let's delete the different attributes. Then let's create a new Razor component that allows us to create clients. So let's create it in the clients folder. And let's call it create.razor. Let's define the route. So it will be accessible at the URL /clients/create. Then let's add the namespace of the different modules. Then let's create a property of type client DTO that we will associate to the form. So we can create it just here. So we can call it client data. Then let's create a form and let's associate this property to this form. So we can delete this title. So we can create this row that contains this column, and then we can display the title new client. Then let's create the first field. So we can add this row. In the label we can display the text first name. Then here we have this input field that is associated to the first name property of this property. So client data that we have here is this property. Then let's add the other fields of this form. So we can add this row. In the label we have last name. The input field is associated to the last name property of this property. Then we have another row for the email address. We have this row for the phone number. Then we have this row for the address. Then here we have the status. So the status will be displayed into this select element. So the status can be one of these different options. Then let's add the cancel and the submit buttons. So we can add this row. It has the submit button and the cancel button. So if we click on cancel, we will go to the URL /clients to display the different clients. And when we click on submit, we will execute the method save client that we have to create. So now let's create this method. Let's create it in the code section. So in this method, we need to send a post request to this URL. So we will send the data of the form. And then we have the response. So we need to check if we have a success response or a bad response. So if we have a success response, then we will redirect the user to the URL /clients to display the available clients. Otherwise, we can read the response. So we will read the error of the response and we can display it on the console of the browser. Then we need to request two services, the HTTP service and the Nav Manager service. So we can request them just here. Let's run the application. Let's click on new client and we obtain this form. So if we click on cancel, we have the list of clients. And if we click on submit, we have nothing. So let's check the console. And here we have the server response that contains the validation errors. So we have an object that contains another object called errors that contains the validation errors. So now to read the errors, we need first to read an object called errors from the server response. So first let's create a JSON object that we will use to store the different errors. We can call it errors and it is of type JSON node. Let's add the namespace of this class. Then let's save the server response in this object. So here, if we have a bad response, then we can store the errors in the errors object. So we can read the server response as a JSON object, then we can read the value of the error key. Now let's display the validation errors of this property in the form. So here we will display the validation error related to the first name. So just here we can add a span. And we will display the first error related to the first name. Then let's display the validation error related to the last name, if any. So we will display the first error related to the last name. Then here we will display the error related to the email address. Then the phone number. Then the address. Then the states. Let's run the application. Let's submit the form. And now we have the different validation errors. So now let's fill the form. Then submit. So here we can see that we are redirected to the list of clients and we have this new client. Now I will show you how to edit clients. So when we click on the edit button, we will go to the URL /clients/edit and we need to provide the client ID. So now let's create a Razor component that will be accessible at this URL. So let's create it in the clients folder. And let's call it edit. Then let's define the URL. So we need to read a parameter called ID from the URL that will be of type integer. Then let's create a property called ID that will be used to store the value of the client ID. We can create it in the code section. So it is called ID as the name that we have here. It is of type integer and it will be initialized from the parameter of the URL. Then let's create other variables. So we can create this field which is of type client that will be used to store the client details. We need this property which is of type client DTO that we need to associate to the form, and we need this property that will be used to read the validation errors from the server. Then let's add the namespace of these models. So we can add it just here. And also we need the namespace of this class. So when we read the client ID from the URL, we need to send a request to the server to read the client details. So let's create a new function. And it is an overridden method that is called onParameterSetAsync. So in the try block, we will send a GET request to the API to read the details of the client having this ID. So ID is the property that we have here. Then we will set the data of this property that will be associated to the form. So we will set the first name, the last name, the email address, the phone number, and the address using the data of this field. Then let's check if we have the client details or not. So if client is null, then we can display a message to the user. Otherwise, we can display the form that will be initialized using the data of client DTO. So we can delete this text. So first let's add this row that contains one column with the text edit client. Then let's check if client is null or not. So if client is null, we can display this text. Otherwise, we can display the form. So we can copy the form from the create component. So we can copy the different rows that we have here. And let's paste them here. Also, let's create another row to display the client ID. So when we click on submit, we need to execute this method that allows us to update the client details. So now let's create this method. So in this method, we will send a put request to the web API at the URL /API/clients, and we will add the client ID to the URL. Then we will send the new client details. So if we have a success response, we will redirect the user to the list of clients. Otherwise, we can read the validation errors and we can display them to the user. So now we need to request the HTTP service and the Nav Manager service from the service container. Let's run the application. So here we have an error. This is because I used HTTP with capital H. Let's run the application again. Let's edit this client. And here we have the client details. So we have the client ID in the URL, and also here we have this client ID. So let's update the email address, the phone number, and the states. Let's click on submit. So we can see that the client details have been updated and we are redirected to the list of clients. Now I will show you how to delete clients. So when we click on the delete button, we will go to the URL /clients/delete and we have the client ID. So now let's create a new component that will be accessible at this URL. And let's call it delete. Let's define the URL of this component. So it will be /clients/delete and we need the client ID. Then let's read the client ID from the URL. So just here let's define a new property. So we can create the property ID that we will initialize from the URL. Then let's update the content of this page. So we can display the text delete client, we can display this confirmation paragraph, so we can display, are you sure you want to delete the client with the ID, which is the value of this property, and then we can add this button that should allow us to delete the client, and we can add this button that should allow us to go back to the list of clients. Then when we click on delete, we need to execute this method that should allow us to delete the client. So now let's create this method. So in this method, we will send a delete request to the web API to delete the client with this ID. Then we will redirect the user to the list of clients. Let's add the services HTTP and the nav manager that we can request from the service container. Then let's test the application. Let's delete this client, for example. So let's click on delete. And we obtain this page. So if we click on cancel, we are redirected to the list of clients. And if we click on delete, we can see that the client with the ID 18 has been deleted.